So Jacob had taken off, left with his wives, left with his entire household, and started moving on towards Canaan. Now we continue the story. He did not tell Laban, and now we read about when Laban found out. That's in Genesis 31:19-21. And Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. So he fled with all that he had, and he rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. Now in verse 19, we backtrack just slightly to before Rachel and Leah were leaving to meet Jacob in the field in verse 4. It was when Laban went to shear his sheep. Now here we see that Jacob did not take Laban's sheep as his sons had said. These were the sheep under the care of those sons and 3 days' distance from Jacob's flocks. You know, this gave Jacob plenty of opportunity to leave with his family and substance and only his share of the flocks, as was mentioned before. Wow, that was not an easy task. Here he had 11 children from ages 7 to 14. Young teens, from child to young teens. And you know what? Sometimes teens can be a wild bunch. I'll tell you. They traveled on camels, going all the way out towards Canaan. So, this gave Jacob plenty of opportunity to part with his share of the flocks. But Rachel was not as honest as her husband. She stole her father's images and carried them away with her. My goodness. She stole from her own father. The Hebrew calls these images that she stole teraphim. These teraphim were actually household idols. They were small figurines of Syrian female deities, female gods. They were used in religious observances, such as foretelling the future, divination, false worship. Now, from one of my books in my library, Wilmington's Guide to the Bible, on page 50, it tells us that excavations in northern Mesopotamia, that's around Haran, where Laban lived, it shows that possession of the household gods of a father-in-law that belonged to a father-in-law by a son-in-law was legally acceptable as proof of the designation that that son-in-law was the principal heir. Do you think that's what Rachel had in mind? We really aren't told. But we do know these idols were definitely a very big deal in the culture where Rachel grew up. We're going to find that out in the next few sessions. Back in verse 17 and 18, we already said that Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, and that he told him not that he fled. Then in verse 21, it says, so he fled with all that he had. He traveled with his wives, his children, ranging in ages 7 to 14. Yes, his cattle and all the livestock he had gained. I don't know, but I think he may have left Laban's cattle with some of Laban's servants, or maybe some of his own servants that were left behind for Laban. We don't know, but we do know that this time he was not dishonest. Then in verse 21 also, we are told he rose up and passed over the river. Well, when they say the river at that point, it means none other than the Euphrates River. Some commentators claim that God wrought a miracle for Jacob on this occasion due to the power of God which accompanied him through the whole journey. They couldn't figure out how he could cross the Euphrates River. See, these commentators, they forget this is a major trade route. And if there was a major trade route, there must have been a bridge of some kind. Sometimes we in the 21st century like to underestimate the engineering marvels of thousands of years ago. Look at the pyramids. Man, there used to be this big, huge statue of Colossus, one of the 7 wonders of the world. What's a bridge for that? You see, well, this is certainly true that God was with them. It must be remembered that Jacob was following a major trade route, like I just said. And that was traveled by Abraham when he was still Abram, when he traveled from Haran to Canaan. Abraham, servant, traveled that route to get Rebekah, his mother. Rebekah went that route to travel back to Canaan. And lastly, Jacob traveled to Haran, crossing that river. Well, being a trade route, there must have been a sort of a bridge. After all, the Bible tells us in verse 21, he passed over the river. Unless he flew over the river, no, I believe there was a bridge that he took all of his flocks over. So after he crossed the Euphrates, he set his face toward Mount Gilead. Gilead actually means heap of testimony. It is the name of the mountainous territory just east of the Jordan River, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. It's a lofty, fertile plateau. And it ranges from 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the sea level. Its western edge is the steep eastern wall of the Jordan Valley through which the Jordan River flows. It's a plateau. It's an upland country with rich woods and productive fields, intersected by valleys and streams. Folks, this is where the medicinal balm of Gilead came from. And this is where Jacob stopped, probably to assess his situation, especially with Esau, before going to see his father Isaac. You realize he traveled about 608 kilometers or 380 miles. He traveled over 3/4 of the way to see his dad. Since God was with him all the way, what was he waiting for? Folks, all I can say is God had his back. God told him to go to Canaan. Well, go to Canaan. God had his back. Folks, I'm thinking about us right now. That would be true for most of us too, wouldn't it? Sometimes God presents a clear path for us to follow. He has it laid out. And we often know exactly what God wants us to do. But then we come to a certain obstacle. Sometimes it's an imagined obstacle, and we hesitate. May I remind you that Paul tells us in Romans chapter 8, verse 31, what shall we say then to these things? You realize if God be for us, then who can be against us? You know the answer.